In the spring of 1981, on a gravel lot behind the Farm Service Agency office in Coldwater, Kansas, a loan officer named Dale Pruitt laid a single sheet of paper on the hood of his truck and told Walt Hensley that the future had already passed him by. The sheet was an amortization schedule for a new tractor, and Dale had filled it out as a courtesy, the way a man fills out a form for someone he has decided to feel sorry for. Walt was 61 years old that morning. He had farmed the same 400 acres of Comanche County his whole life, and he had done it behind a team of mules he called Ruth and Jasper, the grandchildren of the team. His own grandfather had walked off a rail car in 1911. Dale tapped the paper and said the thing that would follow Walt for the next decade. He said it kindly, which made it worse. "You cannot run a museum and call it a farm," Dale said. Then he got in his truck and drove back to town, and the gravel dust hung in the air a long time after he was gone. Now let me tell you about a number, because this is a story that ends on one, and you should carry it with you through everything that comes before. In the fall of 1992, 11 years after that morning, on the gravel, a man with a clipboard added up what Walt Hensley had spent to put a crop in the ground and take it out again, averaged across those 11 years, and the figure he arrived at was so far below the county average that he made Walt repeat his answers twice. I will get to that number. I am asking you to wait for it the way Walt waited for rain, which is to say without complaint and without much doubt, because he had seen enough seasons to know how they ended. Stay with me and tell me in the comments whether you ever knew a man like Walt, because I think most of you did. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Comanche County sits in the southwest corner of Kansas, hard up against the Oklahoma line, where the high plains start to remember they were once short-grass prairie. It is dry country. The rain comes when it comes, which is to say not often and never on schedule, and the men who farmed it in 1981 had spent 2 decades learning to borrow against the rain that might arrive. Walt Hensley had not learned that lesson, and his neighbors had decided this meant he had failed to learn anything at all. He was known for 2 things. The first was that he almost never spoke unless a question was put to him directly, and even then he answered in the fewest words that would carry the freight. The second was that he could read the ground under his boots the way other men read the grain market in the Wichita paper, which is to say completely and with a confidence that came from being right for 40 years. The 2 things were connected, though only a few people understood how. Walt did not explain himself because the ground did not need defending. It simply was what it was, and it would prove him out or it would not, and talking would change neither. The mules were Ruth and Jasper. Ruth was the older of the pair, a tall mare mule the color of wet ash, with one white sock in a way of stopping at the end of a row and waiting that looked to a stranger like stubbornness and was actually arithmetic. Jasper was younger, darker, heavier through the shoulder, and he followed Ruth in everything. They were not the first team Walt had driven, and they were not the famous old team his grandfather had brought west, but they came down from that line, bred careful across 7 decades, and Walt could trace their blood back further than he could trace his own. There was a third member of the operation, too, and her name was Pearl. Pearl was a black and white farm collie who had been born in the corn crib and had appointed herself foreman of everything that moved. She rode at the head of the team when they went to the field, and she lay in the shade of the implement shed when they worked, and she counted the team in and out of the lot every evening with a seriousness that would have been funny if it had not been so exact. Let me tell you about Dale Pruitt, because it would be easy to make him the villain of this, and he was not one. Dale was 34 in 1981. He had a degree in agricultural economics from a good land-grant university, and he had come back to the county he grew up in because he believed, sincerely and with his whole chest, that he could help the men who farmed it. He was not lazy, and he was not cruel. He had read every study the Extension Service put out, and the studies all said the same thing. And the things they said were true inside the numbers the studies counted. A diesel tractor could work more ground in a day than a mule team. It could pull bigger implements. It did not eat when it was not working. On paper, in the columns Dale had been trained to fill, the tractor won every argument, and Dale had never once seen the paper be wrong about anything that mattered. That was his whole problem, though. He would not understand it for 11 years. He had never seen the paper be wrong, so he believed the paper was the world. The dismissal that spring was not the first time someone had called Walt's operation a museum, and it would not be the last. The word followed him. At the co-op, at the sale barn, at the Methodist church, where the farmers gathered in the gravel lot after the service to talk about ground and weather and debt, the younger men used it like a nickname. There goes the museum. They did not mean it with malice, most of them. They meant it the way you tease a man you have quietly decided to leave behind. The word has a meaning, though, and Walt knew the meaning. And so let me tell you about what the museum actually held, because everything that came later was already sitting in plain sight that spring, waiting for the right kind of year to make it visible. A mule eats grass and hay. Walt grew both on ground that would not reliably grow wheat, the draws and the sandy corners and the strip along the creek that flooded 1 year in 5. He cut his own hay with the team, and he stored it in a barn his grandfather had raised, and the fuel for his entire operation grew back every spring without a bill attached to it. A tractor eats diesel, and in 1981 diesel cost more than it had ever cost, because the whole country was still reeling from the oil shocks of the decade before. And the price did not care whether your crop came in. That was the first thing the museum knew that the paper did not. Walt's fuel cost was a function of sunlight and rain. Dale's tractor's fuel cost was a function of a war on the other side of the world, and no amount of careful farming could touch it. Here is the second thing. A mule, worked right, makes more mules. Ruth and Jasper threw a Jenny foal in the spring of 1982, and Walt named her Birdie. And Birdie was an asset that arrived on the place at the cost of a difficult night in the foaling stall and nothing else. Let me tell you about that night because June was there for it, home from the university, on her spring break, and it was the first thing in a long while that her education had not prepared her for. The foal came late and came crooked, and Walt worked in the lamplight for 3 hours with his shirt sleeves rolled past the elbow, talking to Ruth the whole time in a low, even voice that never once rose. June stood at the rail with the lantern and watched her grandfather do a thing that had no line item, no invoice, no number. She could enter anywhere. When the foal finally slid out into the straw and shook her wet ears and tried her legs, Walt sat back on his heels with a tiredness in him that looked almost like grief, and he said only one thing. "There," he said. "That is the cheapest tractor in the county." Pearl, who had lain in the stall doorway through all 3 hours, got up and went to inspect the new arrival, and pronounced it good. A tractor, worked right, makes nothing but a smaller number on a depreciation schedule. Every year it was worth less, and every year it needed parts that came from a catalog and a dealership 90 miles away. And the dealership did not extend credit to a depreciating machine the way the land extended credit to a breeding animal. Walt understood this in his hands before he could have said it in words. His grandfather had said it in words once and had written it down. And I will come to the writing down, because the writing down is the heart of this. The skeptic in this story was Walt's granddaughter, and her name was June. June Hensley was 22 in the summer of 1983, and she had just finished a degree in agribusiness at the same university that had trained Dale Pruitt, and she came home that summer carrying her grandfather's whole way of life around in her chest like a stone she could not put down. She loved him. That was never in question. What was in question was the rest of it, because she had spent 4 years learning the language of yield per acre and capital efficiency and return on investment, and her grandfather farmed in a language that had no words, and she was young enough to believe that a language without those words was a language that could not say anything true. She came to him in the implement shed her first week home. He was greasing the hubs on the haymower, and Pearl was lying in the doorway with her chin on her paws, and June stood in the light with a folder of figures she had worked up at the kitchen table the night before. "Grandpa," she said, "I ran the numbers." He did not look up from the hub. "All right," he said. "If you sold the team and the harness and took out a note on a used tractor," she said, "you could double the ground you work. You could lease the Tilden Quarter and the Schaefer place. In 5 years, you would be farming 1,200 acres instead of 400. Walt wiped his hands on a rag that had been red once. "And what would I owe at the end of those 5 years?" he asked. She had that figure, too, and she read it. And it was a large figure, and she said it the way her professors had taught her to say it, as a sensible cost of growth. Walt listened to the whole thing. Then he set down the grease gun, and he looked at her for the first time. And what he said was not an argument. It was a question, and it was the question that would take her 9 years to answer. "What happens to your 1,200 acres?" he said. "In a year it does not rain." June did not have that figure. Her professors had not given her that figure because the studies she had learned from were built on county averages across good years and bad, and an average has no idea what a single dry year does to a man who owes money on 1,200 acres he cannot water. She started to answer and found she could not, and she was angry at him for a week, the particular anger of a smart young person who has just discovered the edge of what they were taught. Now let me tell you about the man who farmed the Tilden Quarter, because his name was Roy Maddox, and his story runs alongside Walt's like the other rail of a track, and you cannot understand where Walt ended up without watching where Roy went. Roy was 40 in 1983, a good farmer and a good neighbor, the kind of man who would pull your truck out of a ditch at 2 in the morning and never mention it again. He had listened to Dale Pruitt, and he had listened to the extension meetings, and he had done exactly what every authority in his life had told a forward-thinking young farmer to do. In the spring of 1983, he bought a new diesel tractor, a big one, on a 7-year note, and he leased 2 more quarters of ground to justify it. Roy was not foolish. Roy was obedient, which in a fragile system is a more dangerous thing to be. He had taken the best advice available, given in good faith by sincere people, and the advice was sound, the way a bridge is sound right up until the load it was never rated for rolls. Across it, I want to be fair to Roy and to Dale both. The years from 1983 to 1987 were good years in Comanche County. The rain came close enough to schedule. Wheat prices held. Roy made his payments and even got ahead a little, and at the church lot on Sunday mornings he stood among the men who had grown, and Walt stood a little apart. 67 now, still walking behind Ruth and Jasper and the young mule Bertie he had broken to harness, and the gap between them looked, to everyone watching, like the gap between the future and the past. There was a Sunday in the summer of 1986 when one of the younger Maddox cousins, a boy of 19 with more mouth than ground, leaned against a tailgate and asked Walt to cross the lot, loud enough for the men to hear, whether the mules had thrown a colt or a calf that year, and the men laughed, not unkindly. And Walt touched his hat brim and said the team was, well, thank you, and got into his truck. Pearl was waiting in the bed. He scratched her ears and drove home, and that was the whole of his answer. And the men forgot it by the time they reached their own trucks. It is a small thing. I tell it only because the men who laughed that morning would, 6 years on, be driving out to that same quiet man to be taught, and not one of them would remember the joke. June saw it that way, too, for a while. She had taken a job with a farm management company in Wichita, the kind of job her degree was built for, and she came home on weekends and watched her grandfather fall further behind the county every year, and it grieved her because she loved him and because she could not make the grief line up with the figures. By every measure she had been trained to trust. Roy Maddox was winning, and Walt Hensley was losing. The measures were not lying. They were just measuring the wrong years. Let me tell you about the journal now, because June found it in the winter of 1986, and finding it was the first crack in everything she believed. She had come home for Christmas, and she was looking through the roll-top desk in the front room for the deed to settle a question about a fence line. And underneath the deed she found a ledger book bound in cracked black leather, the pages gone soft and brown at the edges. It was her great-great-grandfather's, the man who had walked the first mules off the rail car in 1911, and it was not a diary, it was a record. Page after page of dated entries in a careful, slanting hand, and what the entries recorded was rain. Every rain that had fallen on that ground for 40 years, the date and the amount and what it did to the crop, and alongside the rain, the cost of everything. What a horse ate in a year. What a plowshare cost to replace. What the wheat brought at the elevator. And running down the right margin of every year, in a column the old man had ruled himself with a straight hitch, the one figure he cared about more than any other. It was not income. June looked for income, and it was not the number in the margin. The number in the margin was what it cost him to farm an acre for a year. Cost, not profit, not yield, not the things her professors ringed in red. The old man had understood something that none of her teachers had ever said out loud, which is that a farmer does not control what his crop brings, or whether it rains, but he can control, with enough attention and enough discipline, what it costs him to be there when the rain does come. And the whole point of the mules, the whole point of the museum, was sitting in that ruled margin in a dead man's hand. The cost per acre barely moved. Year after year, through drought and flood and the Depression and the war, the number in the margin stayed almost flat because the inputs that drove it grew on the place or were born in the barn, and the things that grow on the place do not send you a bill from Houston. June sat on the cold floor of the front room with the ledger in her lap until the light failed. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She started, though, quietly to keep her own column. Now let me tell you what happened next, because the years turned and the second dismissal came, and this one was public. In the fall of 1987, the Extension Service held a meeting in the Coldwater High School gymnasium on the subject of modernization and credit, and Dale Pruitt, now 40, and a regional supervisor, gave the main talk. He was good at it. He stood at the front with a carousel projector and threw charts onto a pull-down screen, and the charts showed the steady upward march of yields and acreage among the farmers who had embraced the new methods. Near the end, he made a point of comparing the progressive operations in the county to what he called the holdouts. And though he named no one, every man in that gymnasium knew who the holdout was, because there was only one team of mules left working ground in Comanche County, and its owner was sitting in the third row from the back with his hat on his knee. A boutique liability, Dale called it, in front of 200 of Walt's neighbors. A sentimental attachment to a way of life that the market had already retired. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way you eulogize something, with a kind of warmth, and that was the cruelest part, that he believed he was being kind. He believed he was helping the old man let go. Walt did not stand up. When the meeting let out, he put his hat back on and walked to his truck, and Pearl was waiting in the bed of it, and he scratched her ears and drove home in the dark. June was there, though, in the back of the gymnasium, and June heard the word boutique fasten onto her grandfather in front of the whole county, and something in her that had been loosening for a year came the rest of the way loose. She drove out to the home place the next morning, and she did not bring a folder of figures. She brought a question. "Show me," she said, "show me how you know." And so he showed her. Let me tell you about what he showed her, because this is the teaching, and the teaching is what makes everything after it believable. He took her out at dawn to the strip of ground along the creek. The worst ground he had, the sandy floodplain that the county agents had told 3 generations of Hensleys to plant in wheat and watch wash away. Walt did not plant it in wheat. He ran the mules across it in a pattern she did not understand at first. A tight, folding pattern, grazing and trampling and moving on, and he explained it to her in the plainest words he had. The team's weight pressed the old grass and the manure down into contact with the soil, he said, and that is where next year's ground comes from, not from a bag, from what the animal leaves and what the root holds. He crouched and dug his fingers into the strip and turned up a clod and broke it open for her, and there were worms in it, pale and quick, and a smell came off it like the floor of a creek-bottom timber after rain. That smell, he told her, is the ground breathing. A tractor packs the ground down into a hard pan that sheds the rain. A mule's foot, he said, is the size of a teacup, and it presses and lifts, and the ground stays open, and open ground drinks the rain instead of throwing it away. He took her across the fence to the neighbor's identical ground, worked clean by machine for 15 years, and he dug there too, and the clod came up in one hard, pale piece that did not break so much as shatter, dry to the core, and there were no worms in it and no smell at all. She walked behind him back to his own side of the fence, and she put her hand into the soil again, and it was dark and loose, and it smelled alive, and 40 yards over the wire, the dirt was pale and tight and dead, and she could not unsee it after that. He showed her the foaling records, and the harness her great-great-grandfather had made and mended, oiled leather, still supple after 80 years, because someone had oiled it every winter. He showed her the hay ground and walked her through the arithmetic of fuel that costs nothing because it grows back. He showed her, without ever once raising his voice or calling it a philosophy, that the museum was not a museum at all. It was a machine more sophisticated than anything in Dale Pruitt's catalog, a machine that ran on sunlight and grass and attention and made more of itself every spring. And its great trick, the trick that the paper could not see, was that its costs did not move. Drought could not raise them. War could not raise them. A dealership 90 miles away could not raise them. They sat in the margin of a dead man's ledger, almost flat, year after year after year. June went back to Wichita and gave her notice. Within the month, she did not have a plan that her professors would have recognized. She had a column of her own and a grandfather who would not be on the place forever, and a growing certainty that she had spent 4 years being taught to measure the one thing that did not matter and ignore the one thing that did. Now let me tell you about the year the question got answered, because the universe in this county was just, but it was slow, and it took until 1988 to settle accounts that had been open since 1981. The drought of 1988 is still spoken of in the Southern Plains, the way people speak of a death in the family. It did not announce itself. The spring came dry, and then the rain that should have come in May did not come, and then the rain that should have come in June did not come either, and by the 4th of July, the wheat across Comanche County stood stunted and gray, and the topsoil had begun to lift off the bare-worked ground and move in the wind. June kept her column through all of it, and she watched the two operations meet, the same empty sky. On the Maddox place, the new tractor had worked a beautiful seedbed the autumn before, finely tilled, smooth as a tabletop, exactly what the meetings had taught. That seedbed was the problem. A chemical fact matters here, so let me tell you it plainly. Bare soil under drought does not just fail to grow a crop, it bakes. The sun drives the moisture out of the top several inches, and the structure collapses into a crust. And when a rain finally does come, the hard surface throws most of it off into the draws before a root can reach it. Roy Maddox stood at his fence line in July and watched a brief, hard thunderstorm drop half an inch of rain on his finely worked ground, and watched almost all of it run off red and useless into the bar ditch within the hour. Roy Maddox watched it happen on 1,200 acres. He owed money on. Walt watched it not happen on 400. He owed nothing on. That is the thing the studies had averaged away. On Walt's ground, the years of mule work had built a soil that opened to what little rain fell and held it. His wheat was not good that year. Nobody's wheat was good that year. And his wheat lived, though, where Roy's died, and his hay ground, the ground that fueled his whole operation, came back after a single August thunderstorm, because the roots were deep and the ground drank instead of shedding. Roy's tractor sat in the shed because there was nothing to do with it but make payments on it. A tractor cannot make rain, and it cannot make soil, and in a year without rain, those were the only two things worth having. Let me be careful here, because this is where the niche of this story could curdle into something mean, and Roy Maddox does not deserve mean. He did everything right by the lights he was given. When the bank came to talk about the note that fall, Roy met them at his kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and the conversation was the kind no farmer should have to have, and the sentences in it were broken in the places where a man's voice breaks. He kept trying to explain the seedbed, how clean it had been, how right it had looked, and the words would get partway out and stop. I did what the meetings. Eston so. The banker was not cruel either. He had his own forms and his own supervisor and a column of his own to answer to, and he looked at the table while Roy could not finish his sentences. Roy lost the least quarters first. He held the home place by the skin of his teeth, and he held it because Walt Hensley showed up one October morning before light with the team and put in Roy's winter wheat for nothing and never said a word about it to anyone. Roy came out onto his porch in his stocking feet when he heard the harness chains and stood there and could not speak, and Walt did not make him. Get the gate was all Walt said. And Roy got the gate, and the two men worked the day in the kind of silence that says more than talk, and Pearl rode at the head of the team the whole way and counted them home that night the way she counted every night. June was there for all of it. She had moved home in the spring before anyone knew the rain would fail, and she had spent the dry summer keeping her column and watching the two kinds of farming meet the same sky, and the skeptic was gone out of her by August. What replaced it was not faith, because faith was never the point. What replaced it was understanding, which is faith that has done the arithmetic. Now let me tell you about the number, because the time has come for it, and you have waited the way Walt taught us all to wait. In the fall of 1992, the Agricultural Economics Department at the university sent a graduate researcher out across the southern plains to study farm resilience after the drought years, to understand why some operations had survived 1988 and the dry years that trailed it and others had not. The researcher was a careful young man named Tom Avery, and he worked with a clipboard and a standardized form. And somewhere in Comanche County, a retired loan officer named Dale Pruitt, who had left the agency and never quite stopped thinking about a morning on a gravel lot, told Tom Avery that if he wanted to understand resilience, he should go talk to the man with the mules. Tom Avery came out to the home place on a cold, bright morning in November. June walked him through 11 years of records, her own column and the old ledger both, and Tom Avery added up what it had cost Walt Hensley to farm an acre for a year, averaged across 1981 to 1992. Every input counted, fuel and feed and repairs and replacement. He set down his pen. He asked Walt to confirm the feed figure, and Walt confirmed it. He asked him to confirm that there was no fuel line in the operation at all, and Walt confirmed that too. Tom Avery looked at the number on his form, and then he looked at the county average printed at the top of the same form, and then he asked Walt to repeat the whole thing again from the beginning, because he was certain he had made an error. The number was $19 an acre. The county average, across the same 11 years every neighbor counted, was just over 140. Tom Avery sat in the cold front room and did not say anything for a long moment, and the only sound was Pearl's tail moving once against the floorboards. He looked at the figure, and then at the county average, and then back at the figure, the way a man looks at two photographs he cannot believe are of the same place. Then he wrote the number down a second time, carefully, the way you write down something you intend to spend the rest of your life, explaining. It landed on him with a weight that the figure itself, $19, could not account for. It was not a large number. That was the whole point. It was a small number that had refused to grow for 11 years, while every number around it doubled, and in a dry country, a cost that will not move is the only wealth there is. He asked, almost in a whisper, how a man held a cost flat for 11 years through a drought, and June did not answer him. She only turned the old ledger around on the table so that the ruled margin faced him. 80 years of a dead man's figures running down the page. Almost flat, almost flat, almost flat, and let the column answer for itself. Nobody spoke for a while. Walt got up and put another stick in the stove. Dale Pruitt came out to the place that winter. He was 45 and had no professional reason to be there, and he came anyway, and he stood in the lot while Walt harnessed the team, and what he said was not an apology, exactly, because Walt would not have known what to do with an apology. What he said was a question. How long would it take, Dale asked, to learn to drive them? And Walt, who had been called a museum on that same gravel 11 years before, looked at the man who had said it, and there was no triumph in his face, because triumph was never in him. There was only the long patience of a man who had always known the ground would answer for him in its own time. "Longer than you think," Walt said. "Come back in the spring. Let me tell you what came after, because a number is not an ending, and this story does not end on the number. It ends on what the number made possible." And the word got out, the way a true thing gets out in a small county, slowly, and then all at once. But Tom Avery's study was published, and Walt Hensley's $19 an acre became a quiet legend in a narrow world, and men who had called him the museum began to drive out to the home place, not to tease now, but to ask. Walt taught them. He did not lecture, and he did not sell anything. He showed them the creek strip and the folding pattern of the team and the soil that drank the rain. And he sold breeding stock off Birdie's line to the ones who were serious. And within 5 years, there were 4 working teams in Comanche County, where there had been one, and the men who drove them were not nostalgists. They were farmers who had done the arithmetic. June took over the home place in 1994, and she ran it the way the ledger taught, and she kept the column herself now. In a new book she had ruled with a straight edge the same way the old man had. She did not expand it. She had the figures that would have justified expansion, and she refused them on purpose, because the whole knowledge of that ground was that you farm what you can farm with your own attention, and attention does not scale. And a thing that outgrows the attention you can give it has already begun to die. Roy Maddox kept his home place and put in a small team of his own, and on Sunday mornings the 2 operations stood together in the church lot, and nobody used the word museum anymore because the county had learned what the word had been hiding. Walt lived to see all of it. He died in the winter of 1999 in his own bed in the house his grandfather had raised, and Pearl was on the floor beside him at the end, gray-muzzled now and slow, and she would not leave the room. June found the old ledger open on the desk when she went through his things, open to the last page, where, in a careful slanting hand that was not quite as steady as the entries before it, her grandfather had added one final line beneath 80 years of his family's figures. He had written the cost per acre for his last full year, and beneath it, the only thing he ever wrote in that book that was not a number, he had written 4 words. "The ground keeps books." Let me tell you what that means, because it is the whole of it, and then I will let you go. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they have been at war for as long as there have been men who measure and men who watch. The first kind is wide and shallow and confident. It builds a model and trusts the model, and inside the years the model was built for. It is right about almost everything, and it will tell you, kindly and with a degree behind it, that the future has already passed an old man by. The second kind is narrow and deep and patient. It does not build a model because it has spent 80 years learning that the ground is more complicated than any model, and it does not argue because the ground does not need defending. It simply keeps its books in a margin ruled with a straight edge, and it waits for the kind of year that tells the truth. The drought of 1988 was that kind of year. It did not care about anyone's projections. It rolled across Comanche County like the load a bridge was never rated for, and it found out who had built on the rain that might come and who had built on the ground beneath their feet. What is rigid breaks? What is rooted holds? Dale Pruitt was not a bad man, and Roy Maddox was not a foolish one. They were good men inside a story that counted the wrong things. And the only villain in this was the certainty that a thing you cannot put in a column does not count. Walt Hensley's whole life was a single argument with that certainty, made not in words but in a number that would not move. $19 an acre. A small, stubborn, unmoving figure in a country where everything else, year after year, doubled. He never called himself rich, and he never called himself right. He just kept the team his grandfather kept, and fed them on grass that grew back, and walked behind them across ground that drank the rain, and let the dry years say what he would not. The harness still hangs oiled in the barn. Bertie's grandchildren still work the creek strip in the folding pattern. June still rules her column with a straight edge, and a young collie counts the team home every evening, and the ground, as the old man knew, keeps books no auditor will ever balance, and no drought will ever break. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are two different things. The ground knew it all along. It just took a dry year and a dead man's ledger, and a number too small to believe, to teach the rest of us how to read it.